intelligencesquared.com.
Our final speaker, who is Stephen Chan, OBE, who is a professor of international studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. I would say that he's probably best known for his work on Zimbabwe, but he has written 27 books and more than 200 scholarly articles, so I think he ranges fairly widely. And he was also involved in the Africa-China-US trilateral dialogue. Finally, he is also well known for being very good at karate, but I'm going to ask him to keep his attacks verbal, not physical tonight. Stephen.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you to the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should identify myself a bit more firmly at the beginning. I'm a member of the Chinese diaspora. I don't live on the mainland of China, but I've spent my life working in Africa and living in Africa and advising governments in Africa and in particular advising liberation movements shortly about to become governments and yes, very often about to become very corrupt governments. But let me start with a story of an encounter when I was doing some of this work in the very beginning of 1980 in what was about to become Zimbabwe as Zimbabwe was emerging from its war of liberation. And I was one of the peacekeepers at that point in time. I hasten to add I looked very, very different in a flak jacket and with short hair and dark glasses on. But we're working at lieutenant colonel level, so that whenever I would meet Robert Mugabe's lieutenant colonels, who were my liaison cohorts, seeing that I was Chinese, they would pull out chopsticks and say, "We want to eat with you," in the way that we were taught by your countrymen, because in our hour of need, they came to help us. Ladies and gentlemen, the Chinese association with Africa is not something recent. It's not something to do with a recent explosion of corrupt relationships or anything like that. China has been around trying to help Africa become independent since the very beginning. And the amount of investment that China put into Africa for no return at all in the early Cold War days is something that we've politely glossed out of the situation. What we also politely gloss out of our recognition of today's situation is that we're prepared to paint China black, if I may be excused for using that term, simply because we also want to have access to the same resources that we accuse the Chinese of seeking to pillage. It's a competition, and what happens in the rhetoric that accompanies this competition? The rhetoric that accompanies this competition paints the Chinese black, and it paints the African incapable of making right choices. It's absolutely a rerun of exactly the kind of colonial thinking that encouraged Africa to become weak and corrupt in the first instance, a fault which can be laid at our doors and not at the doors of the Chinese. I want to put a few things straight. There's a lot of wild talk that goes into all of this, and yes, the Chinese have their own interests at heart, certainly in the long term. They do want to supplant the West as the major power in the world. They're prepared to do that through, let us say, peaceful, competitive means. They're quite prepared to help us out of our debt burden. They're quite prepared to buy up our toxic debt, which we incurred by our own spending and banking habits in the first instance. They're quite prepared to buy into Europe in exactly the same way they've bought into America. And the reason for this is that if you look on a world map, Europe and America are much more important to the long-term Chinese future than Africa is. Africa is important because it will help fuel the Chinese coming of age, but it is not the absolute key end result of all Chinese global foreign policy. But what is going on, as you well know, is a global contest as to who is going to be in control of global capitalism 10, 20 years in the future. Will it still be the West? Is the West reluctant to make way for new players? Is that the key element of the game that we're being seen played out? And do we make the Africans the fall guys in something which is much more global? Let me say a few words about what Anna said about the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's not the case that the Chinese proposed 9 billion investment would have been white elephants. That would have opened up the entire south of Democratic Republic of Congo. The infrastructure that was going to be put in would have opened up and empowered an entire region, including the civil society of that region. What the Chinese were wanting to put in were several hundred kilometers of road, of railway, and here comes the important thing, building along that line of road and rail, schools, medical clinics, and wait for this, universities. When you look at the Western profile in terms of how we approach aid, it's curious how we leave out certain aspects there. We leave out universities. Africans only need to have primary and basic education. Do they not? But if you have worked in Africa as much as I have, and you talk to any parent of any family, what do you want to happen to your youngsters? We want them to grow up to be educated. We want them to go to university. If they can graduate from a university, it's a coming of age. We know then they'll be learned and they'll be able to be part of a generation that does not have to suffer as our generation suffered. What the Chinese recognize and what we don't in Africa is the nature of African aspiration. It's got nothing to do with denigration. We use that vocabulary. The Chinese vocabulary is one of aspiration. Now, having said all of that, let me be the first to admit the Chinese get it wrong on an awful number of occasions. But I want to take issue with George's grand generalizations. There's a public sector, as it were, involvement on the part of China, with public governmental involvement, corporations which are largely governmentally or party-owned, and there's a whole host of private corporations and private investors. In particular, some of these private investors are out and out racist, and they are very, very much a disgrace to the image of China in Africa. It was against those people that Michael Sata, now the president of Zambia, and yes, a free election, so Africans can hold free elections, against such people that Michael Sata railed in recent election campaigns, not in the last one 3 months ago, which brought him to power. Yes, the Chinese get it wrong on a whole number of fronts. Certainly they were wrong in terms of sticking to the government in Khartoum for so long, particularly over Darfur. But, as we've heard, in 2008 they changed their attitude towards Darfur quite fundamentally, and having been given credit for that. I was part of the negotiating push in Beijing for that to happen. And the amount of receptiveness that you can get out of the Chinese if you know how to talk their language, and by that I don't mean Chinese language, I mean the sort of language that treats them as equals, that treats them as players on the world scene, not simply as some nouveau riche recently arrived, why didn't you stay backward like you were meant to be so we could rule the world kind of dialogue, but a dialogue that says, okay, you've arrived, we'd better look to our own resources, we can't rest on our laurels anymore, how can we negotiate on equal terms? And the final point I would therefore wanted to make was about the negotiating strategies between China and Africa. This is not between the world's new wicked superpower and a bunch of ignorant natives who can't do it for themselves. Yes, a huge number of these governments are corrupt. Yes, a huge number of these governments are not democratic. No, many of them will not be democratic or uncorrupt anytime in the near future. And yet the growth rates in Africa are phenomenal. If Europe could accomplish 1/2 of those growth rates, we would not be entering double-dip recession at this moment in time. If anybody cannot handle their public economies, it's us, not other parts of the world necessarily. When you are handling growth rates of that sort, are you doing it on the back of an envelope, or do you actually have an idea of what you are trying to do? I'm going to put it to you that African financial and economic growth is understood by African ministers of finance, by African politicians, and they know what it is that they are doing and what it is that they are trying to do, and they know how to negotiate. Let me give you just one example. We often labor the relationship between Angola and China. Angola is meant to be corrupt. Yes, it is. It's meant to be a dictatorship. Well, it holds elections of sorts, but yes, it's a dictatorship. It has no real civil society. Well, it does of sorts, but the president's daughter controls it. It's a giant oligarchy, and at one point in time, the national budget had no subheads, which is quite an extraordinary event, because, of course, what it meant was you had a national budget which could be used as a giant slush fund. It was the advent of the Chinese that changed that, because the Chinese said, if you want to be serious about what we're doing for you and developing your own resources so that you can be a powerful country in the future, not only in Africa but in the world, then you've actually got to be transparent, at least in terms of your own understanding of what your own governmental departments are doing. One of the ironic things in terms of all the rhetoric that has been flying around about China and Africa is how much more transparent and how much more, as it were, circumspect Angolan public accounting has become since the advent of China and its relationships with that country. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, I shouldn't fail to remind you that just 1 week ago, when we were contemplating yet another line of countries in Europe going bust because we could not handle our public finances, the government of Angola kindly offered to bail out the Portuguese. How the worm turns. We don't like it. The least we could do is to refrain from what is essentially racist rhetoric against both the Chinese and Africa.
Thank you. Stay where you are. On this side, Anna, I heard you say, no, that's not true.
No, it's true, and I'm very worried. By the way, the Portuguese government actually asked the Angolan government to help us bail out. It's quite worrying because I'm not so optimistic as you are in what concerns the evolution in terms of the transparency of the accounting. And what, by the way, do you have to say about this Queen's Way? Because it's not in a Queen's Way syndicate. It's not about just opacity of the accounts, it's opacity of the operators. Now, many of the Chinese operators in Africa, namely in Angola, are supposed to be private, but they actually hide interests, government interests, and including People's Republic's Army interests. And this Queen's Way syndicate is something really, really bad for Angola and for Africa.
This is, maybe you should explain to the audience what the Queen's Way syndicate is.
There are bad Chinese corporations just like there are bad American ones, and I can go through a long list of American mining companies who are busily plowing up Democratic Republic of Congo at this moment in time. The thing about China and what we often fail to understand is that our model of a multinational corporation is not necessarily the same model that other people use. The Chinese model of a multinational corporation, from their point of view, is something which is not entirely private. They're quite new at this game of modern global private capitalism, so that their corporations necessarily have a governmental or party, and in some cases, People's Liberation Army shareholding. And yes, some of them can be rapacious, there's no doubting that.